And welcome to Excel Basics. My name is Katie Lebeds, and today's session we will cover pivot tables. So again, if you don't know me, my name is Katie Lebeds. I am the president of a continuous improvement consulting company called Learning to Lean, and I'm also the co-owner of a virtual assistant business called Top Knot Virtual Assistants. In today's session, we will cover how to do a pivot table. So a pivot table is probably one of the most asked questions I get for Excel. And besides VLOOKUP, pivot table, a couple things I'd like to point out before we get started. The first thing is to make sure that in your data source, so we're looking at the pivot table tab in my spreadsheet, our source data has headers. So you need headers on your data in order to do a pivot table. And just as a refresher, my headers are in row 1. My headers are name, class, date, and grade. So before you start your pivot table, I want you to think about what data that you really want to see. The pivot table allows you to summarize and extract significant data from a large detailed data set. So think about what data that you'd like to see. So that is the basis for your pivot table and the reason why we're doing it. Okay, so let's get started. So I have my cursor placed on a blank cell in my dataset tab. And the reason I'm doing that is purely for demonstration purposes. You'll see in a second that you can insert your pivot table into a separate spreadsheet. But today we're going to look at this data side by side with our dataset. I'm going to click on Insert. And it's the first button, first selection on the far left side, pivot table. Now the first question that our pivot table asks us is, where's your data? Tell me where your data is. And you have two selections. You can either show Excel where your data is in this current worksheet or workbook, or even another worksheet or workbook. Or you can connect it to an external data source. So if you had a database that you were connecting to, or a data source you were connecting to, maybe BI, you can connect it that way. But for today, we're just going to look at our data that we have on the spreadsheet. So I'm going to highlight using my left mouse button and dragging, highlight my data in this particular Excel spreadsheet. And this data is looking at all of the students that took Excel classes on different dates and their grades. Then the next question that it asks you is, where do you want the pivot table report to be placed? Do you want it in a new worksheet, which you definitely could, but I'm going to show you for demonstration purposes in that existing worksheet, and it selected that cell I was already clicked on to begin with. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Scroll back up to the top of my page, make this a little bigger for our audience. And the pivot table comes over as blank, right? There's nothing in there. It's waiting for you to tell it what data do you want to display. And though pivot tables seem hard, they're actually very easy to do once you understand your data. So let's think about how we'd like to summarize our data, because that's what pivot tables help us to do. And what we're going to do is, first of all, you look over here on the right side of my screen where it says Pivot Table Fields. Now you know the reason why you needed headers for your data, because those are the field names that it brings over. And we would like to look for each person in this data set. We want to know their average grade for the Excel classes. So how are they doing in Excel? So I am going to drag and drop holding my left mouse button. You can see that there are fields down here. So you literally are dragging fields from up here where it says name, class, date, and grade down to this area at the bottom. So what we're going to look for is we're going to say for each person. So suddenly it shows you your names on the column. So this would be the columns, or pardon me, the rows. And if you make a mistake, guess what? You can just drag it back out. So going across for each row, so for each person's name, I want to know their average grade in the Excel classes that they took. So I'm going to take my grade indicator here, my field indicator here, holding my left mouse button down. I'm going to drag it down to where it says values. Now Excel automatically defaults this as the sum of the grades. Well, I don't want to know the sum of the grades. I want to know the average grade for each person. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the drop-down box where it says sum of grade and go to value field settings. Now, it gives me a choice. Summarize the values by, well, I would like an average. So it's automatically going to do that calculation for you. And I would like to see that average as a percent, right? So I want to see that they had 95% average in the particular Excel classes. So I'm going to move over to number format. I'm going to click on percentage. 2 decimal places are fine. You can change that depending on your data. And I'm going to click OK. Come back to this original value field settings, click OK once again. And now you can see that this pivot table has displayed for each person, that's the row. It was telling me in that column average of the grade, and it shows me the average grade that they received for attending all of those Excel classes. So that's pretty cool, right? It's much easier, much faster to be able to do this than try to summarize the data on your own, or even use the subtotals, which we covered in classes in class 4. All right, so that was our first pivot table. Hopefully you're looking at this going, man, that's not very hard. You can change the filters, you can sort A to Z, you can say you only want to see Dale Jones information. Just like any other Excel column, it has those same features. Now I want to show you one more way to use pivot table. So we are going to look at the class, we're going to look at the average grade of each of the Excel classes by the date that they were held. What was the average grade? So again, just so we go through this once again, I'm going to insert a pivot table. So I'm going to leave this one up here for demonstration purposes. I'm going to add a new one down here. So I've clicked on an empty cell. I go to Insert, Pivot Table. It says, where's your data, basically. So I select my data once again and choose the location where you want it to show. We want it in that cell I just clicked on and click OK. Now, before we get off this screen, let me explain why I highlighted the data. If I were just to highlight the columns and say my data is in columns A, B, C, and D, what it's going to do is it has the potential to pick up the entries of blank. So anything below row 81 to Excel looks like it's blank, and that skews your data a little bit, and you definitely don't want to have the blank information anyways. It adds no value in your pivot table. So that's why I highlight the data and only the data we're looking at. And I click OK. Okay, so it put in another pivot table here. And like I said, this time we're going to look at for each class. So I'm going to take class and I'm going to drag it down with my left mouse button, release when it gets to rows. I'd like to look at the average grade of each class on the date that I presented it, or the date that I gave the class. So the column across is going to be date. Drag and drop that over there. So you can see that it has automatically tried to show me by month. I don't need it by month. I just need it by date. So I want to see the actual date that I gave this. I'll scroll it over for you. And now I'd like to see the, again, average grade of those Excel classes given on the particular dates. Now, as we saw before in the previous pivot table, it automatically defaults to sum of grade. So what we want to do is change it. Instead of sum, we'd like the average. So I use my drop-down field marker here. I go to Value Field Settings. And can you guess? We're going to click on Average. Change my number format to percentage. Click OK and click OK again. Now it is showing me for the Excel class that was held in January, the average grade was 80.75%. Now, there could be situations where I held the Excel class in January, February, March, April, May, and it would average the grades for each of the times that the class was offered and giving you a grand total at the end. So as you can see, it's saying the average for all of my classes, the average score for Excel class 1 through 10 was 85.7, and that validates with the previous pivot table that we did, where we said by person, tell me their average grade, right? And it was 85.7. So again, my pointers for you for Excel pivot table is really to make sure, first of all, that you understand your data set and really get your head wrapped around what do you want to see for the rows? What do you want to see for the columns of information? And again, what calculation do you want in the middle? And as you saw here, you can do sum, so it would summarize or add them all together. It can do a count, max, so it'll show you the max number, the min number, the product, etc. So standard deviation, there's a lot of different variables that you can use here. But really, it's taking the time to understand and say, what do I want to get out of my data in order for you to construct the correct type of pivot table. And again, moving your data around here is just simply drag and drop and return, so you can play with this and see what looks right for you. So again, thank you so much for attending today's pivot table class. Hopefully this was helpful to you and enlightening, that you were able to learn that they're not so scary. It's really a feature that helps you a great deal, saves you a lot of time from your own personal calculations here. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. And thank you so much for attending today's session, and have a wonderful day.